Welcome back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Zhao Ying. China has strongly criticized Japan for provoking bloc confrontation as Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida repeatedly attacked China ahead of the G7 summit. Kishida said in a recent interview that the G7 will seek to protect the so-called international order by opposing what he called the unilateral attempts by China and Russia to change the status quo. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said China resolutely opposes Japan's rehashing of the same old arguments and sparing no effort in smearing China. He pointed out specifically that Japan is trying to use those statements as a cover for its own attempts to unilaterally change the status quo.
If Japan truly opposed the unilateral changes to the status quo, it should clearly restrain the forces trying to turn back the clock on history, seriously reflect on its own history of militaristic aggression, reaffirm its adherence to the post-World War II international order, and abide by the One China principle.
For more, we are now joined on the line by Professor Swara Singh, Chairman of Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Singh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your program.
How do you look at Fumio Kishida's recent remarks on how the G7 should oppose what he called unilateral attempts by China and Russia to change the status quo? And he also repeatedly warned that Ukraine might be East Asia tomorrow. Why do you think he's been making those comments ahead of the G7 summit?
As you know, these are comments on expected lines, and it is not just now, even earlier, even the other leaders of Japan have made similar statements, lately trying to underline how China's increasingly close relations with Russia, and of course their no-limit partnership, means that, just as China today, as they believe, stands with Russia in Ukraine crisis, Russia potentially would also stand by China in case a similar tension happens in Asia-Pacific region. But at the same time, we understand that it's only part of the orchestration that some of these nations make and occasionally say these sort of rather harsh words. In reality, even yesterday, for example, China and Japan started for the first time a hotline between the two defense ministers, which was set up on 31st of March. And of course, the whole trade and investments and every other kind of relationship, the reality often seems to be far different compared to how sometimes these rhetorics are built, particularly on certain occasions like the G7 summit meeting taking place this weekend.
Okay, but would you agree with Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin's remarks that Japan wants to use those arguments as a cover for its own attempts to unilaterally change the status quo?
These are rather complex matters of territorial jurisdiction and their claims on it. And each side, China and Japan, of course, have their own versions of what they believe is the reality and whose claims are stronger and valid compared to the other side. So I think these are more posturing that one notices in these speeches rather than any actual reality on the ground. And reality on the ground involves both contestations and enormous amount of cooperation. But very often, I think the contestations and speeches like these make much bigger news. And of course, I assume leaders on both sides fully understand and have a more measured and balanced assessment as to how far they should be impacted upon by such harsh statements from either side. And I assume that is visible the way relations have been conducted over years and years between China and Japan, that they have had very strong economic relationship, people-to-people relationship, cultural and social relationship, and sometimes politics hots up and some statements get made. But these are very often addressed to domestic constituencies rather than the other country where these are apparently supposed to be aimed at.
Okay, but what about the position of other G7 members? Because we know that French President Emmanuel Macron said last month during his trip to China that Europe should not get caught up in crises that are not ours. What did he mean by that?
I think that's again a sentiment which has been echoed by almost all nations, including India, which is going to be invited as a special guest at the G Summit meeting, and India has always been invited as a special guest. That I think we need to make distinction between not sort of extrapolating things beyond a kind of a feasible possibility, and this whole enormous campaign that Ukraine and tensions in Indo-Pacific are connected are nothing more than European nations seeking a role and influence in the Asia-Pacific region, and want to extend that argument to Asia-Pacific. But reality is that most of the G7 countries, including special invitees like Australia and India, have a strong economic relationship with China. In fact, China is the largest trading partner for most of these nations. And second, very quickly, I think after this more than 1 year of continuing Ukraine crisis, G7 also, I think, intends to now, shift the focus back to what is its original mandate, which is to manage macroeconomics and economic governance rather than focusing far too much on geopolitics. And very quickly, the debt crisis in the United States is going to definitely be a focus area for G7 to look at how they can manage global economy, which is already getting impacted because of this debt default crisis, which is making President Biden cancel his tour to Papua New Guinea and Australia. So I think the focus is going to be shifting towards their core responsibility of managing markets and macroeconomics rather than getting drifted into geopolitics and political rhetoric.
Okay, but it's also reported that G7 members will declare a joint response to economic coercion to send a signal to China. How do you look at that?
It's again a perception that countries often have about each other. There is no doubt that China in last 30 years has come to be the center of global value chains, production chains and supply chains. Almost up to 30% of global manufacturing happens in China. Now, in principle, that's not a kind of a very ideal arrangement for international relations. It has to be better spread out, but that is the reality now. And right now, G7 countries are focusing on redesigning global supply chains, onshoring and friendshoring and so on. But this is not going to happen overnight. I understand it is an important awakening moment for G7 to make sure that they do not become excessively dependent on China in terms of production and supply chains. But even rectification, even in best circumstances, will take, I think, another decade or more. It's not going to happen tomorrow. So it's good that they're beginning to think like that, and that will be good overall for the international economy to have it more balanced and more predictable arrangement rather than depending on one singular nation. Even for China, that kind of production has cost China in terms of its environment, in terms of social transformation and so on. Any single country producing for the entire world has its consequences, both good and bad. So more balanced production would be ultimately good, but that's it. Uphill task. That's not going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Professor Swara Singh, Chairman of Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at Jawaharlal Nehru University. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back.